Several months ago, Olga and I had the privilege of attending a film screening for Zuza Banasińska's Grandmama and Sister Cat in Łódź, Poland. And we were so enamored by the artist. So it's a real joy to have them here as our guests for this podcast. To quote their website, Zuza is an artist and filmmaker from Warsaw, based in Amsterdam. In their practice, they are interested in the reproduction of images and how these enable the reproduction of systems, subjects, and bodies. They engage with this theme through the lens of embodying and queering archives. In their essay films and installations, they employ a multi-layered approach that incorporates found and recorded video, game engines, sound, and sculpture to construct intricate ecosystems. These serve as spaces for interrogating and destabilizing entrenched notions of identity, gender, and representation. In this podcast, we talk to them all about that and more. We would like to thank them again for agreeing to chat with us and also send a big thank you to Nadirashvili, a dear friend who helped guide us in the editing process of this recording. Hope you enjoy listening. And if you want to hear more about similar topics, make sure to check out other EUTERPE podcasts in the library.
This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
The first question I have for you is, can you tell us where you are situated at the moment, where you do most of your work, what space you call home, and how those are different from each other?
Yeah, so it's actually quite interesting in the context of this film, because I'm in my childhood bedroom right now in Warsaw, Poland. So yeah, this is not a usual place for me to be in. I usually live in Amsterdam and I work in Amsterdam. Most of my work is made in an old hospital room, actually, where my studio is. From there, I kind of navigate different spaces that are geographically and mentally very much further from the Amsterdam space. So mainly, I guess my works correspond to Poland and to Eastern Europe and thinking about dislocation in a sense also. So I quite like the question of what space you call home and how these are different from each other. Because then I was thinking which is the actual one that I call home, especially thinking now that I'm in my actual, what people usually call home. And perhaps I don't feel that way anyways. So then I thought that maybe I consider home more as a temporal space rather than a physical one, some kind of a memory or some sort of glimpse from the past that I try to follow in my work. Perhaps maybe an affect that can be recreated through some sort of relations, different kind of relations, also within images. So I think this is kind of what happened in this work, that I saw home within these footage, and I was kind of following it and trying to grasp it. So there's a sort of idea of a desire in the concept of home.
And being as you are in Poland, could you tell us how to properly pronounce your full name? So that
Yes, Zuza Banasińska.
Zuza Banasińska. No one probably asked you that question in Poland, and I'm wondering if there is that safe familiarity when you go back there, and how do you negotiate the self and your art in terms of different contexts and audiences that need to be considered? Like, I'm guessing in Poland, people ask very different questions. So what kind of things come up abroad?
Yeah, I think in terms of this work, it's quite prominent that the questions are different. It was great also to show this work in Poland because the questions were much deeper, and the level of engagement also and the level of understanding of the footage was way bigger, which was interesting. But I also find it quite interesting to work on all of these topics from the Netherlands, being situated in the context that is very international and very kind of there's something about the Netherlands that they seem remote from everywhere, that they seem this kind of tabula rasa in a sense, which of course they are not. But there is that kind of feeling, especially in terms of art, because so many artists from abroad are working there, that you can distance yourself from whatever topic you are actually probing or investigating. So in that sense, also the questions that come up there, also the questions that I pose to myself there, are way different then when I am embedded within Poland, there's also this like very strong emotional pull and emotional connection that sometimes I think if I stayed in Poland and I worked in Poland, perhaps I wouldn't come to the same conclusions because I need that distance at some point, and I need to look at what I'm making and what I'm looking at from a further kind of perspective. But for sure, sometimes the questions that I get in the West are very basic in a sense, which I also don't consider bad because of course, I mean everybody has their own perspective, and possibly a lot of people are not familiar with this reality. But it's quite interesting that a lot of people consider this like very appealing, also aesthetically appealing, this film. In the West, there's a sort of maybe even like a fetishization a little bit going on of communist reality, which is quite interesting. While in Poland, I really feel, I've heard it many times, the people call it trippy because it's so uncannily close to home, perhaps. I don't know. Yeah.
I think that the next question is kind of related to what we were mentioning in the last part about the reception and the different views on the film and their perspectives. Now, this question, I want to focus more like on some visual aspects that I think that really contrast some of the different aspects that are approached in the film, Grandmama and Sister Cat. But in the short film, you use different archive materials from the educational film school in Łódź, if I'm not wrong. Well, you tell the story of what seems to be a matriarchal family using the figure of Baba Yaga as a sort of catalyst for the story, right? So in this regard, more than in the content that we will discuss this later on, I would like to start with the visuality, especially on using fragmentation and collage as a way to explore this family story. And this contrast that we talk maybe about perception on so-called Western audiences and maybe more local ones. And of course, like, why did you decide to work with them with fragmentation and collage?
I think I always work with fragmentation and collage, I guess because that's how I think somehow. And maybe because my life is a bit fragmented also because of the different realities I have to split it into. Since I was a kid, I was splitting my world into these different realities, also spending some time on like this patriarchal side of reality and then the matriarchal one. I guess I understand fragmentation the most. I see that like this is how meaning is produced also, as like this kind of negotiation between multiple elements. So whenever I kind of go into a topic or I start to research something, just everything starts to multiply and multiply and multiply and layer, and I see links between different elements. And then there's just no way of presenting that also in a linear way, because the story that is in the film is not really linear. It's more of a space. I kind of see it as creating this like collage spaces in a sense, where different realities merge together, co-creating this reality that I find myself in. It's just the easiest way of putting my research together, or maybe not the easiest, but the most kind of embodied and the one that comes natural in a sense.
I really like the idea of knowledge being produced through fragmentation. I think a lot of people can relate, especially if they moved from the place that they live in terms of being fragmented yourself. The next question, if you could talk us through the artistic process that you followed when you were excavating your personal history and the stories through the archival footage you worked with. How did you read your personal experiences and memories through these fragments of texts and films? Obviously, you use a voiceover, but what was the initial sort of planning process? Did you always know that you were going to add on the story on top of it? Did it come organically? Did you sort of have to shoehorn it in? How did you deal with that?
So, I mean, to give a bit of context also, the project came from a research group in the VN Lab in Łódź, which is an institution that works with essay films next to the film school. They organized this research group that would work with the educational archive in Łódź. And we received like a PDF catalog of different films. And I think there was around like 1,000 or something of titles. And then all of us could choose a certain amount of titles that we want to explore. yeah, at the time I was researching cars and the idea of like industrial reproduction and image reproduction. So I chose only films about cars. I had no intention of working with my family or the memories or anything like that. And then, yeah, as the group kind of developed, it turned out that we can see the choices of others. Thankfully, a lot of other people have chosen more interesting materials than just like car videos, which, by the way, were quite interesting in themselves, but there was a bit more variety. So in the end, I ended up having around 300 films to look at. And then I just started watching them. And perhaps also because I was watching them in Netherlands, I really felt that within this footage, I kind of have this like faint idea of a home that I wanted to follow. And perhaps I was also starting to see my family within this footage. And I tried to understand why. So I guess this film kind of came out from this process of self-investigation. Why do I feel so strongly connected to this footage? Well, a lot of it is very didactic and kind of showing this like disembodied objective male perspective that is sort of like delivering knowledge. But there was something very dark in it that I kind of also related to my own personal experiences. I found it very interesting to think about the archive itself as this kind of like objective collection of traces from the past, where they're sort of like grouped and contextualized to generate meaning. But then I was thinking like, yeah, the meaning is not really inherent within the material itself, but more in how the archive is organized. So how can I organize the archive differently to group it together differently so that it creates new meanings? And then I thought, okay, family sounds like a very good, and my own personal experience seemed like a very good way of grouping this footage differently and thinking of it more of a like a relationship of kinship with it, rather than this like very disembodied way of looking at images as they look at, I don't know, women, animals, plants, whatever, as these kind of specimens that they are analyzing within these films.
In this regard, for me, it's super interesting what you mentioned about this kind of tensions between this sort of tenderness that is open in the film mixed with this kind of uncanniness or abject landscapes that also I think to create. And we noticed that one element that is present in both the visuality and narration of the film is distortion, and helps a spectator, helps in rendering certain moments of the films as uncanny and abject, as it was mentioned. One example that come to my mind is the case of the childish voice that acts as the narrator, and sometimes you make this use of distortion and it becomes sort of monstrous. So in that vein, but applied in the case of the visual elements from the archive, does the distortion of videos which pre-existed reflect this space of contestation that you were mentioning of yourself? And if yes, can distortion become a space itself, maybe related to this way of becoming by being kind of collage or a split and not linear? Because I think it resonates a lot with one of the quotes that I really loved from the short film that was, I think, I'm growing, not up but sideways. Like it's somehow all of this related, and in particular the use of distortion was really interesting for us. So if you could elaborate on this, that would be perfect.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think distortion has been very important, not only in this work, but in all the works that I make, because I think also for making present the distortion, you kind of start to realize the artifice of the original material. And of course, I think I had to find a balance that it doesn't become distorted too much, in a sense. But the original idea of the visual distortion, of this effect of like blurring or warping in the film, came from like a very strong, even like visceral reaction to some of the footage that was incredibly sexist, where I was thinking also in terms of reproduction and like, how can I reproduce this footage, showing what it is, but critiquing it at the same time. So maybe it was a way of me rejecting it in a sense, also of like just having strong feeling of I cannot put it the way it is exactly, because then I'm just reproducing the violence that it originally contains. But then I thought that it's actually a very interesting tool to sometimes mark the imageness of the images, in a sense. The images that are disturbed, you kind of start to see that these are images, pixels on the screen. And you start to question a bit more, like how representation is fixing these different identities presented in the footage. So in a sense, yeah, this distortion, perhaps it is a space in itself. I kind of see it more as sort of forces, and forces that are competing in a sense with each other. So on one hand, I see it as patriarchal gaze that is penetrating through the footage. Yeah, has this like force of destruction and violence in a sense. On the other hand, I saw it as a way of the family, of the matriarchal family, of protecting themselves and blurring certain moments to kind of reject the patriarchal reality. Two forces that compete within themselves and create this hybrid, weird, distorted reality. And then when it comes to the voice, this growing up sideways is actually taken from this book about queer childhood, where they kind of talk about queer children as children that grow sideways, no linear progression. Yeah, they amass, they become layered in a sense, in a horizontal kind of direction. Also, the title reflects that all the words of the family members are connected. So, in a sense, to me, the narrative voice is all of these characters and none of them also at the same time. So, this child, well, it came first of all from also the original footage itself that often related to children or addressed children, or children were the narrators. So then I thought, how can I use that, but kind of question the childness of that voice? I guess that's why it becomes also so uncanny, because it's my voice and I just pitched it digitally. I guess I thought also about the child, somehow that the child is the image as well, that doesn't want to be captured fully.
Growing sideways, right? That was a quote, if I remember correctly.
Yes, it was now I know, Catherine Bond Stockton.
I know this from a folk song by Noah Kahan. Really profound for me, at least. The title is Growing Sideways, but in the lyrics, he just says, I ignore things and I move sideways. So it's just, I think it's a rumination on depression. And so for me, it was more that. So I think it's cool to hear you talk about how you connect that to the idea of queerness and queer childhood. This quote was inspired by a book that you read. And then, of course, you're watching these videos, nostalgic. I don't want to say nostalgic because, it's a horrific time, the Soviet Union for most people, but a sense of like the past coming in and the memories of maybe things that you don't even remember, but you understand that they existed. But then you're bringing in the very real things that you experienced as a person and as a member of your family. So the fifth question here is, if the story told in the film is from memory, if you fictionalized it at all, if there's a mixture of both, if one thing led to the other in the creation process.
It's definitely both. I think they were feeding each other constantly. The blend of them is quite unpenetrable in a sense that like I don't even know anymore which one is the fiction and which one is an actual memory. Of course, there are certain things I know because I've heard them. For example, like there's this moment of the mom and the aunt taking care of the grandma, and that's basically my mom's and my aunt's life these days, because my grandma is 103 years old and she needs to be taken care of, and they have been doing that for quite some time. So the whole grandma bit, I would say that it's not even memory, but from actual reality now. And she also, each time that I see her, I saw her a couple of days ago, whenever I ask her, how are you doing, she's just like, oh yeah, I just want to die, which is kind of the story that she's repeating for, I would say, at least 25 years already. There are these elements that are very dear to me and very emotional, but then these elements are quite often, like, for example, the taking care of the grandma was not coming from memory, but more coming from the archives when I saw the footage of two women handling like an IBM, this like massive IBM computer from the 70s. And then I just saw basically, oh, this is mom and aunt, obviously, and this is grandma. So it's quite interesting to also to be in this process where so many of these different situations that are completely removed, in a sense, from the literal representation of my memories, that they triggered these memories. It was quite an interesting process also in terms of my research into how to break this kind of representationalist approach in making films, in making images, thinking of how also this archive is so full of this quote unquote objective knowledge from this embodied God view male perspective, and how this actually creates the reality that they want to portray, that they want to analyze, and how can I create a reality that is different with the same footage. So in that sense, I was thinking, how can I feed or create a mixture of citation, of memory that produces another reality of these women. Perhaps it's a bit of a magical realist reality. For example, there is also this bit of the aunt who is biting walls. And this is something I found in a book. And then actually I've heard from a friend that this is something that women in Slovakia would do when they were pregnant. They would bite the walls of buildings because there was a lot of calcium in them. So it was quite a healthy practice. And then I connected that to my aunt, who is a very kind of rational person. She's a chemistry teacher, scientist of our family. And it's kind of thinking of this is something that she would do. And then connecting it also to the images of this Soviet production of houses, of buildings, of building blocks, and how that reproduced also certain ideas of family as well.
Writing walls, that I think that's a very common, almost mythologized story from a lot of countries with poor healthcare systems in the not too distant past. In Georgia, women used to eat chalk, I think, during pregnancy because they were lacking calcium. And my husband's mom was quite prone to eating newspapers because the newspaper also has the ink has calcium on it. It does make me think so much about women's healthcare and access to information about what their body needed and why they were crazy. I would just think I was going crazy if I was pregnant and wanted to eat buildings. It's just so interesting to think about.
You were mentioning this will to break the representationalist approach, which is very much not male-gazed, which is, but also kind of this God complex. So for me, it was really interesting when you were mentioning this kind of magical realism or even speculative realism of fabulation as well, so as to portray this material that has been kind of conceived are kind of hegemonic and univocal truths. So you mentioned this about the walls that you were saying. So not much about how to choose existing materials, but what is your approach to kind of develop a narrative? Like, what are the maybe, I don't know, authors or kind of stories or forms of subjugated knowledge that comes to matter for you in order to create the short film? Also connected to that is how does this process influence or is connected to this form of collective memory or inheritance that can be also be part of the audience that is going to see this film maybe in Poland, for instance. Like, how do you negotiate not only the creational process of choosing the materials and what kind of approach, but also if you think about the potential spectators or are the spectators that are in your mind when you are creating, if there are any, because maybe you don't think about that.
That's interesting. I mean, I try to answer to it that yes, I think about the spectators. I mean, for sure. Also, the funding bodies in Netherlands want me to specify which target group is my target group, which age, etc., etc. But to be honest, in this case, I think I didn't think of the audience. I guess I thought about it in the end process, but when I started making it, it was like a very, very personal journey in that sense, and maybe more thinking about my family and my closest ones and how they would react to it what would I want to communicate to them through that film. But then, of course, I mean, as the film progressed, I was thinking about that more and thinking about also like, how do I make it a bit more universal without too many inside jokes or whatever. Also, how the process kind of formed was very much rooted in the existing materials. I was looking at the footage for months, putting things together, sometimes just like cutting out little clips, throwing them on the timeline, changing the sound and seeing what does that create. And I think that's where I find the power of working with archives. The archives are very interesting in a sense of how can they perform reality or like shift from this representationalist approach to this more like performative approach of making images, and how in a sense like this is the process that is most fascinating to me, that I can really take certain bits and pieces and change, reshuffle them, add some narration, and then they perform a completely different reality. In that sense, it's also interesting to think of this collective memory and inheritance of like how, again, this reorganization of these different bits of memory can create an idea of a different history or a different past that can also influence how we view the now or the potential future.
I think that flows really well, the idea of inheritance and the audience, into one of the things that I, as an audience member, picked up during the interview that we had in Łódź was you talking about the idea of a mother tongue, basically this inherited vocabulary of how you spoke at home with your family compared to how you spoke outside of the household. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the idea of motherhood and this kind of genealogy of women, how that relates to language in a sense of literally linguistics, like how you speak, but also the idea of mother tongue. And now that you're not living in Poland, and in this very interview, you're speaking with us in English, how that sort of genealogy or inheritance of your family has followed you throughout the different languages and different linguistic contexts. If it's difficult to showcase that when you're doing the English voiceover on your films or not.
Yeah, I think so. The idea of the mother tongue within the film is very much based on this kind of rejection of everything in Polish related to groundedness being called like the fatherland, the father tongue. Everything is kind of like father related and patriarchal. And that was very much not the reality in my house where I was growing up. That there were all these women, and there was not really any father tongue present. The father tongue was kind of outside of the house. So there was a kind of a renegotiation of different registers that I was shifting between. And I found that quite interesting. This idea of the child that is in the formative stages, this kind of normative structures are imposed on them, and how that also follows through linguistics as well. There is a sort of feeling also that I had with the footage itself that it is a mother tongue for me. I mean, the footage itself, I would say, like in its original form, it's constructed in a father tongue. But then I was thinking, like, how to recompose it into a mother tongue, and how to then decompose this mother tongue into this like very specific kind of child tongue or whatever, let's call it, that would become a hybrid of the two. I think English in that sense was quite a very useful tool for bridging the gaps between these different registers and different ways of thinking, and also of considering language and how like also the violence is reproduced through that language. The way I was writing it sometimes in Polish, sometimes in English, always checking how the English translation would look like, because I knew that the film is going to be subtitled, and like the people that are going to see it first are going to be people who don't speak Polish. So it was very important for me that it sounds good in English as well. And I think that going back and forth between languages was a very good tool also to create these kind of hybrid moments within the narration itself. Yeah, and then also in terms of the figure of the mother, also connected to linguistics in that sense, there's the Baba Yaga, who is this Slavic character from Slavic folklore, the evil witch believed to be coming from the Great Mother. So like the cult of the Great Mother ended with the introduction of the patriarchy. Of course, this is not objective knowledge or something. This is just a theory. And then with the patriarchy and then Christianity, the Great Mother got turned into this like evil and ugly witch that eats children. And I found it very interesting also to think of her as this kind of structure that embodies these different shifts also between patriarchy and matriarchy and creates this hybridity. I was researching also how did this name even come up with? So the word baba, which now in most Slavic languages and in Polish, it's a very like derisory term for a woman. It often means like an ugly or an old woman. I think in other Slavic languages, it can also mean just a woman, basically. But the root of the word in different languages serves to create different words for example, grandmother, but also father, sister, or child. So there's this like simplicity of the word itself that is easily uttered by a child that allows for an expression of kinship. I found her as an interesting figure to kind of think through her of kinship that can exist within these different structures that are either patriarchal or matriarchal. And basically, how can I reproduce this patriarchal reality? And then, of course, I make this twist into the matriarchy, but that also becomes quite violent in many ways. And the mother within the film, women in the film, I wouldn't say that they're kind of the epitomes of peace or like of caring. I mean, in a sense they are, but they are way more complicated than that. And how to make them through this Baba Yaga also in a sense monstrous, but in a very like productive sense monstrous.
This is super interesting because I think that you kind of both portray the child and Baba Yaga as ways of undoing, kind of going back to the basics, so going back maybe to the etymology of something, and kind to speculate with it kind of opens up ways to think differently and maybe create performative approach that you were mentioning. So in this regard, there are like a lot of depiction of inherited tradition and practices that are passed down through generation of women in your family in this case. So how do you mediate the relationship between your critical outlook on this and the tenderness that stems from I think your short film? Because I think for me that the answer that you were elaborating a while ago, I think that really it takes the critical as not only as destructive, as there's always ways to come up with something effective and affirmative out of what we maybe have envisioned that is just patriarchal or just negative. So how do you mediate like this relationship between being critical but also kind of be tender about the things that you are working on and bring also more affirmative and effective responses to that?
I think that's the big challenge because a lot of this footage just makes me want to destroy it. I guess maybe that's where where like this kind of embodied research into the archives comes in. If you spend time with it, if you really create this relationship of kinship with these elements or like objects of the past or whatever you to call them, there is a tenderness that starts to appear. And of course, I'm also thinking like, so this is what happened in my family. This patriarchal reality was pushing them down so hard that then they created this enclave of matriarchy where they kind of were pretending that the patriarchy doesn't exist and that all men are bad. Yeah, I would go outside of the house and there were men and I had to do something with them. Also, I have to live in that society also. So perhaps this affirmative approach is like a big desire of mine to kind of try to integrate these realities together, to kind of see how can I queer the patriarchy. That sounds really terrible, but in a sense, perhaps that's what I was thinking about, and how can I take it and still see with it some sort of like muddied hybridity that can result in some sort of kinship and togetherness, especially taking this footage that is so didactic. I still inherited this footage in a sense, and I inherit both of these realities that were clashing, and then that inheritance creates something completely new and monstrous within me. So that was kind of the process that I was trying to implement within this film. And with the film that I'm working on right now, it's even more intensified because I'm working on a not documentary, but where I film people, actual people, and because it's a lot about history and archaeology, a lot of the people that have a voice are men, in contrast to this film where there's basically no men. In the next film, there's going to be a lot of men. And then I think also how to represent them without, again, reproducing this patriarchal didactic voices, but more seeing this like affect or tenderness towards their representations and what can I create out of them that actually questions their so-called authority.
Returning back to translation, how you explore and translate personal experiences of gender roles, sexuality, transgeneration, and family in your work. We were wondering if you have shared your work with family members, and what was that like for you if you have? And if not, why have you decided not to share it? And if you feel a certain kind of responsibility to them when telling not only your story, but also theirs.
For sure, I do feel a responsibility. And in terms of sharing, I would say that my mom is kind of like a collaborator on the film. She's seen it from like the early clips that I made that were just ideas. And then she's seen almost every edit. She would always give me advice. It's been also like a very, I don't want to say therapeutic because I don't like to think about like, art being this kind of therapeutic device, but perhaps it does incite conversations that I wanted to have with my mom that perhaps was easier to have with the film as this kind of playing field or something that we can refer to in order to talk about the past and like how our family has been constructed. She and my aunt, how they see themselves in the world. In that sense, I think it has proven to be very productive, but also because my mom is like a super open person and she's a literary translator. So she kind of understands also this like intertextuality or like, remaking of different realities and this idea also of transgeneration. She understands it in a very artistic way also. With the other family members, I think they've seen it. Not sure if they fully understood it or are interested in understanding it. Funnily enough, my dad saw it and said that it was great and we never had a conversation about it somehow, which I found quite interesting. I was very afraid to share it with him because I thought he would definitely feel excluded in some ways. But he did exclude himself when I was growing up. So perhaps he understood that. Yeah, I think also it has been a very useful tool also for talking about non-binarity with my family, especially with my mom. Since I came out as non-binary a couple of years ago, and it has been a long process of kind of trying to explain to my mom what that means. And of course, she's like a very educated woman, so she does her own research. But this was a very good way of kind of showing it to her, or like the critique of the gender roles that she might have inflicted also on me unwittingly in many ways when I was growing up.
It's really nice, like the story of your mom being a translator, and then kind of your films can be depicting like this translation process of offering new affirmative ways of looking to the past. Even do you consider it as a non-binary person and also transnational author? Like, how do you perceive the word of translation itself? How do you relate with the notion of a translation, not a linguistic translation, but concept which is in a process of becoming?
I think the concept of translation has been really important to me, especially working with found footage. I feel like it's always related to translation, having this thing that you have to represent in a different way. And this process of mixing it or like of remixing it, remaking it is quite potent in a sense. So I thought also in that context, I guess I thought about queering a lot, not as a direct narrative, but rather as an action of like queering the normative images and how the process of the child's construction of their world starts to bend the original material. So I really like this idea of queerness also as a bending of straight lines. And I think that relates a lot to translation as well, because the translation always curves the original text in some way or another, or the original material. So in that sense, I was interested in what kind of turns I can make to still reproduce, in a sense, the original footage, but to twist it in a gentle way that creates a different framework for seeing it and for experiencing it. I guess maybe what was really important was to think about not only what is represented in these images, but how. For sure, the editing is the most important element. And I love editing. I love sound design. I love how that can create a completely different framework and different reality. How I was able to translate the story of the family throughout these different organisms that appeared in the archive. So really creating these characters that are not just human, but they are also buildings, they are animals, they are spaces, they are, microbes. So that this also, I guess, the becoming, or perhaps maybe this process that we have transformation of these characters happens continuously through the editing, and we never have a stable identities. They're constantly remade and remade and remade. So I was curious how I could multiply different contexts also to a point where the link with the existing reality that produced this original footage is kind of severed, and something unknown or uncanny starts to appear.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting and answered all of our questions beautifully. I really appreciate you giving us the time today.
Thank you so much. I really love the questions. So nice to talk to you. And I discover also new things while talking about it. Thank you.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.